In 1952, a British Army psychologist named John Whitmore watched 50 men quit an elite selection course in a single week, and he realized that the quitting itself was the test. The Special Air Service wasn't trying to train soldiers into becoming elite operators. They were trying to reveal who was already unbreakable. 70 years later, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, and Green Berets still rely on his framework, while startups continue to hire based on resumes. What Special Forces selection figured out about human performance is something your hiring process completely ignores. Once you understand it, you'll realize that the interview questions you're asking aren't just ineffective, they're actively screening for exactly the wrong traits. Let's start with what selection actually means, because most people misunderstand it completely. David Stirling founded the Special Air Service in 1941, right in the middle of World War II, operating behind German lines in North Africa. The decision he made violated every principle of military training at the time. Rather than training soldiers to become elite operators, he would select people who already possessed the traits that couldn't be taught, and then train skills on top of that foundation. The traditional military model came from Prussia. Take anyone, break them down, rebuild them in the army's image. Frederick the Great perfected this approach in the 18th century, and every Western army copied it for generations. Stirling and the psychologists who followed him argued that this model was fundamentally wrong. Some characteristics become fixed by the time someone reaches adulthood, including psychological resilience, response to ambiguity, and the ability to function when exhausted, cold, hungry, and uncertain. These aren't skills that can be developed through training. They're traits, and you can't install them. You can only reveal them. That insight led them to build a course designed to do one thing, which was to create conditions where a candidate's true character becomes visible. Not their prepared character or their interview character, but their actual character when the stakes are real and the pressure is sustained. Selection takes place in the Brecon Beacons in Wales, and candidates call it the Hills. The conditions are deliberately miserable, with cold rain, fog, and endless mountain navigation while carrying a 55-pound rucksack. But here's the thing that most people miss. The physical difficulty isn't the point at all. The physical difficulty serves as the delivery mechanism for psychological pressure. It works the same way a doctor uses a stress test, where the treadmill isn't measuring your running ability, but rather measuring how your heart performs when demands exceed comfort. The SAS cadre, meaning the instructors running selection, almost never yell at candidates. They don't play mind games, and they don't try to break you. They just watch. What they're observing is what you do when you've been walking for 16 hours and you're lost and it's 2 in the morning and no one is going to tell you if you're on the right path. They watch whether you check your map or keep walking and hope for the best. They watch whether you maintain your pace or start cutting corners. They watch whether you help a struggling candidate or pretend you didn't see him. Fitness isn't what they're evaluating. Decision-making under sustained stress is what matters to them. And they've learned something that startup founders desperately need to understand. The way someone performs in comfortable conditions tells you almost nothing about how they'll perform when things get hard. The American equivalent makes this philosophy even more explicit. U.S. Army Special Forces Assessment and Selection produces Green Berets, and it takes place at Fort Bragg and Camp McCall in North Carolina. The course runs for 24 days, and candidates face what's officially called the whole candidate evaluation. Physical fitness represents just one component among many. Intelligence, psychological stability, motivation, and teamwork all get evaluated, but the key factor is the ability to perform in ambiguous situations without external validation. That last part deserves unpacking. During land navigation exercises, candidates receive a set of coordinates and orders to reach them. Nobody tells them the right route, or how long it should take, or whether they're doing well or poorly. They walk into the woods alone and figure it out. The cadre records where they went and how long it took, but that information stays hidden for days. This drives certain personality types insane. Candidates who need constant feedback, who need to know if they're winning, who need external validation to stay motivated, these candidates often quit before the course ends. Not because they failed at anything, because the uncertainty becomes more painful than the physical challenge. General Stanley McChrystal, who later commanded all special operations forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, wrote about this phenomenon extensively. Special Forces calls it comfort with ambiguity, and they found it's one of the strongest predictors of success in actual operations. Operators might spend weeks in hostile territory without communication, making life or death decisions without any confirmation that they're doing the right thing. Now, this comfort with ambiguity isn't just a military trait. It's the exact same characteristic that separates employees who thrive in early-stage startups from employees who struggle. Almost no hiring process tests for it. Think about what early startup life actually looks like in practice. Unclear responsibilities blend with shifting priorities and limited resources and contradictory information. Long stretches pass where you don't know if the company will exist in 6 months. Decisions have to be made without enough data. Y Combinator partners call this cockroach mode, meaning surviving conditions that would kill anything less adaptable. Candidates who thrive in that environment are the ones who can operate without a map. Candidates who struggle need constant direction and validation. Special Forces selection tests for this by putting you in the woods alone with a compass and coordinates. Startup hiring tests for this by asking behavioral interview questions where the candidate has rehearsed their answers, or by asking them to reverse a binary tree on a whiteboard. Google's own people operations team found their legendary puzzle interviews had zero correlation with job performance, and they published this finding in 2013. Most companies are still copying the old Google. The bridge between these worlds is a principle I'll call selection over training. Special Forces assumes they cannot teach someone to be comfortable with ambiguity, so they can only find people who already are and then develop their skills. Startups usually assume the opposite, hiring for skills and hoping candidates adapt to the culture. Special Forces has a 70-year track record of building the highest performing teams on the planet. Startups have a 90% failure rate and consistently cite hiring as one of their biggest problems. SAS psychologists identified 3 traits that couldn't be faked, couldn't be trained, and predicted performance under pressure with uncomfortable accuracy. Here's how to test for them in a conference room instead of the Welsh Mountains. The first trait is what SAS psychologists call response to uncontrollable stress. During selection, candidates face situations where their effort gets decoupled from their outcome entirely. You can navigate perfectly and still end up in the wrong location because the map is outdated, and yes, they sometimes issue outdated maps deliberately. You can perform well on a team exercise and still get selected for additional punishment because someone else made a mistake. The cadre designs it this way because they want to see what you do when trying hard doesn't guarantee success. Some candidates adapt to these conditions. They focus on the controllable, meaning their own effort and their own decisions, while letting go of outcomes they can't influence. Other candidates fixate on the unfairness instead. They complain and start gaming the system instead of doing the work. They burn mental energy on resentment instead of problem solving. The first type becomes a Special Forces operator. The second type quits or gets cut. Translation to startups is direct. Every early-stage company is full of uncontrollable stress. Market conditions change overnight. Competitors launch unexpectedly. A key customer churns for reasons that have nothing to do with your product. A funding round falls through at the last minute because a partner at the VC firm left. Employees who thrive are the ones who can absorb these setbacks without spiraling. Employees who struggle need their effort to reliably produce predictable outcomes. That's why hiring from big companies for early-stage roles carries so much risk. At Google or McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, effort and outcome stay tightly correlated. Work hard on the right things, and you get promoted. The systems are stable enough that merit gets rewarded predictably. That's not a character trait, but rather an adaptation to an environment. Championship sports franchises struggle to develop players for the same reason. Because systems optimized for winning reward optimization rather than adaptation. Put that same person in a chaotic startup where merit sometimes loses to luck and they often can't cope. Zenefits provides a cautionary example. When they scaled from 15 to 1,600 employees in 2 years, they hired aggressively for skills and assumed culture would follow. The company nearly collapsed under compliance violations and regulatory problems. Their hiring process never tested for what special forces psychologists would recognize immediately, which is ethical resilience under pressure, meaning the ability to maintain standards when no one is watching and shortcuts are available. GitLab does something counterintuitive in response to this problem. They make candidates complete a paid trial project that includes deliberately ambiguous requirements. The goal isn't to trick anyone, but to watch how they handle uncertainty. Do they ask clarifying questions or assume they understand? Do they communicate proactively when confused or go silent and hope for the best? Do they ship something imperfect on time or miss the deadline chasing perfection? The project functions as the selection course and the deliverable becomes almost secondary. That's the first trait. The second is what U.S. Army psychologist Paul Bartone calls psychological hardiness, which has 3 components. Commitment means staying engaged with your work even when it's difficult. Control means believing your actions matter even when outcomes remain uncertain. Challenge means viewing setbacks as opportunities to learn rather than threats to your identity. Angela Duckworth's research on grit covers similar territory, but Bartone's framework offers more specificity about what grit actually looks like under pressure. Special Forces selection tests all 3 components, but challenge orientation matters most. The cadre watches how candidates respond to failure. Did you fail a timed land navigation exercise? What did you do next? Did you analyze what went wrong and adjust your approach? Or did you make excuses and blame the terrain and blame your equipment and decide the test was unfair? Navy SEAL selection at BUD/S in Coronado takes this to extremes. Hell Week runs for 130 hours of continuous activity with almost no sleep, and candidates fail constantly. They fail boat races and runs and inspections. The failure is the point of the exercise. The cadre isn't trying to find candidates who don't fail. They're trying to find candidates who fail, learn, and keep performing without their identity cracking. Roughly 75% of candidates who enter BUD/S don't finish. Research on who makes it through reveals something fascinating. It's not the best athletes. It's not the candidates with the highest test scores. Candidates who respond to failure with curiosity instead of defensiveness are the ones who complete the course. Researchers at the Naval Health Research Center studied BUD/S completion rates and found that psychological hardiness predicted success more strongly than physical fitness. Dr. Charles Morgan at Yale has spent decades studying this phenomenon, and Special Forces candidates who make it through selection show measurably different stress hormone patterns than those who don't. The resilience is physiological, not just psychological. Now think about how most companies hire. Technical interviews operate on pass-fail logic. You either solve the problem or you don't, and if you don't, the interview ends. You never get to show how you respond to failure, because failure ends the evaluation instead of being part of it. Stripe approaches things differently. They have candidates work on a realistic but time-constrained project with a deadline deliberately tight enough that most candidates can't finish everything. Whether you finished isn't the evaluation criteria. How you prioritized when you realized you couldn't do everything is what matters. Did you communicate proactively? Did you make smart trade-offs? Did you ship the most important thing well, or did you try to do everything poorly? Or did you go silent and try to hide that you were struggling and turn in something half-finished at the last minute? Notion's Ivan Zhao has talked about hiring for what he calls learning rate, meaning how quickly someone improves when given feedback. During their interview process, candidates receive real-time coaching and direction, and the evaluation isn't just about starting performance. The delta between where you started and where you ended matters more. In a fast-moving startup, your ability to improve matters more than your current skill level. These companies are doing what Special Forces has done for decades, which is designing evaluation processes where failure is expected and response to failure is the actual measurement. The third principle might be the most important one, and it's the principle almost no startup gets right. Special Forces calls it peer evaluation, and it works exactly how it sounds. Candidates rate each other. The Romans understood this principle 2,000 years ago, though their version was considerably darker. When a unit failed in battle, commanders didn't execute the worst performers. They had the unit execute every 10th man by lot in a practice called decimation. The brutality served a purpose because soldiers knew their peers would judge them before any officer did. The cohort policed itself. The SAS found a mechanism with the same psychological effect and considerably less bloodshed. U.S. Army Special Forces selection weights peer reviews heavily in the evaluation. After team exercises, candidates rank their teammates on several dimensions. Who would you want with you on a real mission? Who contributed the most to the team's success? Who didn't carry their weight? The cadre treats these peer reviews as critical data, and what they've found is counterintuitive. Candidates often judge each other more accurately than trained evaluators can. The cadre sees performance in structured exercises. Peers see behavior in unstructured moments. They notice who helped with gear without being asked, who complained constantly, who took credit for others' work, who stayed positive when things went wrong, and who cut corners when they thought no one was watching. Robin Sage serves as the final exercise in Special Forces qualification, and it leans heavily on peer dynamics. Candidates get organized into small teams and dropped into a simulated unconventional warfare scenario lasting several weeks. They operate in realistic conditions with role players, ambiguous objectives, and incomplete information. Cadre observe throughout, but peer dynamics determine a huge amount of the evaluation. The reason goes back to what the Special Forces community calls the RSOF truth, which states that humans are more important than hardware. Knowing who your peers trust matters more than any individual assessment. Medical residency matching figured this out independently. The match system has programs and applicants rank each other in a bilateral selection process. Your credentials get you interviews, but peer-level judgment from residents you met during the interview day often determines whether you match. The formal interviewers see your performance in structured settings, while the residents see how you act at the informal dinner the night before. Bridgewater Associates, the hedge fund run by Ray Dalio, does something similar with what they call believability-weighted decision-making. When there's a disagreement, the votes of people with relevant track records count more than the votes of people without them. It's not democracy, but weighted peer review, and Dalio built one of the most successful hedge funds in history using that system. There's a direct translation for startup hiring. When you bring candidates in for on-site interviews, you probably have them meet 5 or 6 people on the team, and each interviewer gives a thumbs up or thumbs down. Then you aggregate the feedback in a hiring committee. But you're missing something that Special Forces figured out. The interviewers are peers, not just evaluators. They're the people who will actually work with this candidate day to day. So instead of asking, "Would you hire this person?" you should be asking, "Would you want this person on your team for a critical project with an impossible deadline and unclear requirements?" That phrasing matters enormously. "Would you hire?" activates analytical mode, meaning the question becomes whether this person has the right skills and background and whether their resume checks the boxes. "Would you want on your team?" activates intuitive mode, meaning the question becomes whether you trust this person to perform when it matters and whether you'd want to depend on them. Former Delta Force Commander Pete Blaber wrote about this distinction in his book on Special Operations Leadership. The question they ask isn't whether someone is qualified. Qualification is table stakes because it's what gets you to selection in the first place. The question is whether you'd want this person next to you when everything goes wrong. That's a fundamentally different filter. And here's the uncomfortable truth about peer evaluation. It surfaces information that interviews miss entirely. Interviews reward people who are good at interviews, meaning people who can tell compelling stories about their past and present well. and have prepared answers for your behavioral questions. Peer evaluation rewards people who are good at work. Those are different skills. The candidate who prepared perfect answers for your questions might be a nightmare to collaborate with. The candidate who seemed nervous in the interview might be the one your team would trust with their most important project. What Special Forces figured out 70 years ago in the Welsh Mountains, and what most startups are still learning through painful trial and error, is that selection is fundamentally different from evaluation. Evaluation asks whether this person can do the job based on what they show me in controlled conditions. Selection asks who this person is when conditions are uncontrolled and pressure is sustained. Response to uncontrollable stress, challenge orientation after failure, and peer-validated trustworthiness. These aren't three separate ideas. They're all expressions of the same underlying truth, which is that the traits predicting success under real conditions stay invisible in artificial conditions. You can't see them in a resume. You can't see them in a prepared interview answer. You can't see them in a whiteboard coding problem. You can only see them when someone doesn't know they're being tested, or when the test is real enough that preparation doesn't help. That's why most hiring advice gets things backwards. Hire slow, fire fast sounds wise, but Special Forces does the opposite. Selection is brutally fast, taking weeks rather than months. But once you're in, the unit invests heavily in you. Speed of rejection combined with depth of commitment is the formula. They know that slow hiring doesn't mean better hiring. It often means more time for candidates to learn to perform instead of revealing who they actually are. Résumés turn out to be nearly worthless as performance predictors. A résumé tells you what someone did in their previous environment, but it tells you nothing about how they'll function in your environment, which has different pressures and different ambiguities and different failure modes. You're hiring based on past performance in a context that no longer applies. A Stanford study found that the correlation between resume quality and job performance is barely better than chance, meaning you'd get similar predictive power from a coin flip. Technical interviews produce so many false positives and false negatives for related reasons. A technical interview measures problem-solving ability in a controlled environment with a known answer. That's almost never what startup work looks like. Jazz musicians don't audition by playing prepared pieces. They audition by jamming, testing real-time response to unpredictability. Special Forces land navigation works the same way, and your interview process should too. Culture fit interviews fail for similar reasons. They measure whether someone can seem likable for 45 minutes, but they don't measure whether someone will still be collaborative when they're exhausted and behind on a deadline and just got criticized in front of the whole team. Next time you're hiring, ask yourself the question David Stirling asked in 1941 and John Whitmore asked in 1952. What is this process actually selecting for? If the answer is people who are good at interviews, then you're doing it wrong. The best operators, the best startup employees, and the best teammates all share a common trait that the SAS identified 70 years ago and that most hiring processes still don't test for. They perform consistently when no one is watching, when the outcome is uncertain, when effort doesn't guarantee success, and when the map they were given turns out to be wrong. The best hiring process isn't built with better interview questions. It's built with better conditions, meaning conditions that reveal character instead of rewarding performance. Conditions where the test feels real. Conditions where failure is part of the evaluation rather than the end of it. The cadre in the Brecon Beacons knew this when they handed candidates outdated maps and watched what happened. Now you know it too. Special Forces selection and startup hiring seem like two fields that shouldn't have anything in common, but the best ideas aren't invented. They're discovered in domains that already solve the problem. That's what we do here. We find the hidden architecture connecting fields that seem unrelated. Want to see how emergency room triage protocols can fix your product prioritization? Subscribe, because next week we're covering how championship poker strategy explains product market fit. Leave a comment with the most misleading interview performance you've ever witnessed, whether that's someone who crushed the interview and couldn't do the job, or someone who struggled in the interview and turned out to be invaluable.